At exactly 2 p.m. on October 6, 1973, the quiet of Yom Kippur shatters in an instant. Without warning, Egyptian artillery opens fire all along the Suez Canal, unleashing one of the biggest bombardments since World War II. Israeli outposts on the Bar-Lev Line vanish under smoke, sand, and exploding shells. Bunkers shake. Firing ports collapse. Soldiers sprint through choking dust just to reach radios. At that same moment, far to the north, Syrian tank brigades surge over the Golan Heights. Hundreds of Syrian T-55s and T-62s roll forward with infantry packed on top, firing as they drive. Israeli watch posts barely have time to radio the first warnings before mortars and tank shells slam into their positions. The country is hit on both fronts at the exact same second. Across the canal, Egyptian engineers aim massive water cannons at the Israeli sand walls. Within minutes, the supposedly impossible barriers collapse into mud. Egyptian commandos land in small boats, rushing Israeli strongpoints and cutting communication lines. Behind them, wave after wave of assault boats move across the canal in tight formation, hundreds of them, each packed with infantry trained for this exact moment. Egyptian helicopter teams strike targets deep behind the Israeli lines, hunting artillery and command posts. In the air, the shock spreads even faster. Syrian jets roar low over the Golan, bombing Israeli radar sites and air bases. At the same time, Israeli radar operators in the south watch their screens fill with blips, dozens, then hundreds, far more than they can process. They assume at first it must be a malfunction. It's not. The operators call their supervisors. Their supervisors call headquarters. Within minutes, it's clear. The country is under massive, coordinated attack. Israeli soldiers are caught completely off guard. It's Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. Bases are at minimal staffing. Many commanders are at home with their families. Vehicles sit unfueled. Ammunition stocks are low. Thousands of reservists are in synagogues, cut off from the first reports. Those on duty scramble to man positions that are already under fire. Some sprint across open ground under artillery. Others fight inside bunkers filling with dust and smoke. Every second, the situation worsens. On the Golan, Syrian artillery pounds Israeli positions so heavily that some outposts lose half their defenders in the first minutes. Tanks in the northern sector are overwhelmed by the sheer number of Syrian vehicles pouring across the frontier. Israeli commanders radio that they are being hit by a force much larger than intelligence had predicted. No one understands how the attack came with zero warning. On the Suez Canal, the scale of the Egyptian assault becomes obvious. Under the cover of the artillery barrage, they begin assembling huge pontoon bridges. Bulldozers push sand aside. Infantry dig in instantly on the east bank. More troops keep crossing non-stop, forming organized lines within minutes. Israeli tank units attempt to respond but find themselves alone, facing thousands of Egyptian infantry armed with new Soviet anti-tank weapons designed specifically to defeat Israeli armor. Every minute hands more momentum to the attackers. Israel can barely track what's happening, let alone respond to it. The section ends with Israeli high command finally seeing the full picture. This is not a raid, not a provocation, not a border clash. This is a coordinated invasion by both Egypt and Syria, timed perfectly, aimed at overwhelming the country on its holiest day. Israel realizes in real time that it has only hours to hold the line. Shift fully to the southern front, where the situation becomes critical almost immediately. As Israeli tank units race toward the canal to counterattack, they run straight into Egyptian infantry teams armed with brand new Soviet Sagar anti-tank missiles. These missiles are guided manually, flying slowly but precisely, and Israeli crews have never faced them in combat. Tanks that would normally dominate the battlefield are hit from extreme range. One by one, Israeli vehicles catch fire or explode. Commanders report entire platoons wiped out in minutes. The narrow roads toward the canal become death zones. Egyptian infantry have dug in along every approach, using sand berms, trenches, and anti-tank ditches. Israeli armor tries to force its way forward, but each advance ends the same way: burned-out tanks, scattered crews, and no gains. The Bar-Lev Line, Israel's main defensive position, is already compromised. Egyptian forces overrun some outposts within hours. Others are completely surrounded. Soldiers trapped inside call repeatedly for reinforcements, but most are too far away to help. Meanwhile, the Egyptian engineers continue expanding the crossing. Within the first afternoon, they have built multiple pontoon bridges strong enough to carry tanks and armored vehicles. Thousands of fresh troops pour into the Sinai. Soviet-made artillery and anti-air systems follow right behind. The Egyptians now have a fully structured army on the Israeli side of the canal, something Israel's pre-war doctrine said should be impossible. Israeli commanders quickly realize they are facing a scale of force they were never prepared for. Reserve units rush from civilian life straight into battle. Some arrive still wearing holiday clothes under their uniforms. They are ordered to move immediately toward the front even though they are still forming, still receiving equipment, still figuring out where to go. The Israeli Air Force attempts to turn the tide. Squadrons scramble from bases across the country, taking off within minutes of the attack. Their goal: hit the crossings, break the bridges, and stop the Egyptian advance. But the Egyptians have built a wall of air defenses, dozens of SAM-2, SAM-3, and SAM-6 systems, stretching kilometers deep on the west bank of the canal. Israeli pilots fly into a deadly grid of missiles. Some aircraft are hit immediately. Others dodge missile after missile, but cannot reach their targets. Within hours, Israel loses more planes than in some entire months of the Six-Day War. On the ground, the pressure keeps rising. Several Bar-Lev forts radio that Egyptian infantry are already inside their perimeters. Others report ammunition shortages and request rescue. The terrain itself gives the Egyptians an advantage. The sand walls collapse easily, exposing bunkers. Israeli attempts to relieve the forts are blocked by the Sagar teams waiting along every approach. Within 24 hours, Israel faces something it has not seen since its founding: the collapse of an entire defensive front. The Egyptian foothold has become a full-sized bridgehead. Entire Israeli armored brigades have taken losses they never imagined possible. Commanders begin telling headquarters the truth no one wanted to hear. Israel cannot stop Egypt from holding the East Bank. The old doctrine, the Air Force will break any attack, is gone. For the first time, Egypt has a defensive umbrella strong enough to block Israeli air dominance entirely. And Israel now understands that the southern front is collapsing faster than anyone believed possible. Shift to the north, where the situation is even more desperate. At 2 p.m. on October 6, 1973, Syrian armored columns storm across the Golan Heights with overwhelming force. Hundreds of T-55s and T-62s roll forward in tight formation, firing as they advance, supported by infantry, artillery, and waves of Syrian aircraft striking Israeli positions. Israeli defenders on the Golan are outnumbered almost 10-1. Most of the standing forces in the north are thin, spread across long defensive lines, with only a handful of tanks covering huge sectors. Outposts fall quickly as Syrian units bypass them or overwhelm them with direct tank fire. Some isolated Israeli tanks fight until their ammunition is gone, firing the last shells they have before switching to machine guns, then radios, then silence. Syria breaks through in multiple sectors at once. In the northern Golan, Syrian units push toward the plateau roads leading straight into the Jordan Valley. If they reach those junctions, they can potentially roll all the way into northern Israel. Israeli commanders see what is happening and realize the scale of the crisis. Reinforcements are still hours away. The few tanks holding the line are about to face entire Syrian armored brigades on their own. The most desperate fighting centers around a small region later known as the Valley of Tears. In this narrow sector, fewer than 40 Israeli tanks hold off more than 400 Syrian tanks. The Israelis dig in on ridge lines, firing down at the Syrians as they pour into the valley. Syrian shells slam into Israeli hulls and turrets. Israeli tank commanders jump between vehicles, replacing killed or wounded crewmen on the spot. One tank commander radios, "I have 5 shells left." Another responds, "I have 2." Communications break as radios are destroyed. Officers are killed one after another. Remaining tanks fight alone, firing by instinct, relying on experience to survive 1 minute at a time. Syrians keep pushing, convinced the Israelis must be collapsing at any moment, but the small Israeli force holds, firing relentlessly, switching positions constantly, and striking Syrian tanks faster than the Syrians can react. Still, the line is barely holding. New Israeli units arrive in small groups, individual tanks, pairs of tanks, partial platoons, but they are thrown into battle immediately, without briefing, without rest, without even knowing where the front line actually is. They simply drive toward the sound of the fighting. For hours, the battle sways back and forth as Syrian forces push deeper into the Golan. By nightfall, Syrian units have advanced farther into Israel than at any time since 1967. Israeli High Command begins preparing for a worst-case scenario: evacuation of northern civilian towns. Army headquarters in the north sends messages to the government warning that the Golan may fall within hours if reinforcements do not arrive. For Israel, the northern front is moments away from total collapse. The turning point begins with the arrival of Israeli reserves, the lifeline the country has been desperately waiting for. By the early hours of October 7 and 8, reserve tank battalions reach the Golan after racing north from all parts of the country. Crews who were in synagogues 48 hours earlier are now stepping into tanks and entering combat within minutes. They move straight into the fight, replacing exhausted first-line units and reinforcing critical choke points. On the Golan, these fresh reserve forces push into the Valley of Tears and the Central Plateau, where the heaviest fighting still rages. Israeli tanks duel Syrian armor at point-blank range. Many tanks are knocked out, but crews climb into spare vehicles or join surviving crews in whatever tank still runs. Day and night blend into one long battle. Smoke covers the hills. Burning tanks light up the night sky. Slowly, the tide shifts. The Syrians, who expected a quick breakthrough, begin taking heavy losses. Their columns thin out. Their reserves struggle to keep pace. Syrian officers report catastrophic tank losses and request reinforcements that cannot arrive in time. By October 10, Israeli forces launch a counterattack. After stabilizing the lines, they push the Syrians out of the central Golan, then drive forward, forcing Syrian units back toward the 1967 ceasefire line. That same day, Israeli forces push so hard that they eventually advance beyond the line and begin approaching the outskirts of Damascus itself. The northern front is no longer collapsing. It has turned into a counteroffensive. Meanwhile, on the Sinai front, the situation is just beginning to stabilize. After suffering heavy losses on the first day, the Israeli Southern Command reorganizes its battered units. New tank brigades merge with survivors from shattered battalions. Crews that lost their tanks are reassigned instantly. Ammunition and fuel are rushed to the front. Israeli commanders prepare a new counterattack to stop the Egyptian advance and regain some control of the battlefield. The Israeli Air Force, after losing many aircraft on the first day, adapts quickly. Pilots plan strike routes that avoid Egyptian SAM zones and take advantage of low-flying approaches to hit targets without climbing into missile envelopes. These new tactics reduce losses and allow Israeli jets to support ground forces again. Israeli armored brigades begin pushing forward in coordinated attacks. The fighting is vicious. Each Israeli advance is met by Egyptian infantry with Sagger missiles and RPGs. Israeli tanks take losses but keep moving, using speed and close-range engagements to minimize Sagger effectiveness. Artillery from both sides pounds the desert. Smoke rises from destroyed tanks on both sides. Israeli counterattacks do not break the Egyptian line, but they stop the Egyptian advance. The critical moment arrives when Israeli forces finally manage to regroup, stabilize the front, and dig in along more defensible terrain. The Egyptian expansions on the east bank slow down. Their units consolidate positions instead of driving deeper into the Sinai. For the first time since the war began, Israel stops the momentum of the Egyptian assault. Both fronts, the Golan and the Sinai, have shifted. Israel is no longer collapsing. It is still heavily outnumbered, still taking heavy casualties, and still fighting on the defensive. But the worst is over. The country has survived the opening shock. And now, for the first time in the war, there is room to breathe, and room to strike back harder in the days ahead. The war changes direction in a single moment. The moment Israeli intelligence spots a widening gap between Egypt's Second and Third Armies. After days of brutal fighting in the Sinai, drone photos and intercepted radio traffic show something strange. The Egyptians have overextended. Their defensive umbrella of SAM batteries doesn't fully cover the space between their two main armies. General Ariel Sharon, already pushing for aggressive action, immediately sees an opportunity that no one else wants to risk: cross the Suez Canal into Egypt itself. It sounds reckless, even suicidal. The Egyptians hold the entire East Bank. Their SAMs dominate the sky, and Israeli forces are still recovering from enormous losses. But Sharon insists. He argues that the only way to stop Egypt's advantage is to hit their rear, break their SAM network, and force them into chaos. After hours of debate, High Command agrees. The operation begins instantly. Israeli engineers rush toward the canal under heavy Egyptian artillery fire. Bulldozers shove rubble aside as bridging equipment is hauled into place. Egyptian snipers and missile teams target every movement. Israeli tanks fire non-stop to cover the engineers. Despite incoming shells, the first temporary bridges are pushed into the water. Sharon orders his units to move immediately. There is no time to wait. Israeli paratroopers cross first in small rubber boats, paddling across the canal at night while artillery and tracer fire streak over their heads. Minutes later, Sharon leads the first tanks across the improvised bridge. The crossing is chaotic, desperate, and incredibly dangerous. But it works. Israeli forces land on the West Bank, behind Egyptian lines, something no Egyptian commander believed was possible. Panic spreads inside Egyptian headquarters. The Egyptian Third Army suddenly realizes Israeli forces are moving directly toward their command posts, their artillery, and their supply lines. Egyptian officers start shouting across radio channels, demanding reinforcements that do not exist. Meanwhile, Israeli units begin their real mission, destroying Egypt's SAM batteries from behind. One by one, Israeli tanks and paratroopers hit the missile sites that had dominated the skies for days. Fireballs rise into the night as SAM launchers explode. Suddenly, the Israeli Air Force has open air corridors again. Jets streak into the sky, hitting Egyptian armor columns, convoys, and artillery positions that had been safe the entire war. Egyptian counterattacks come fast but arrive in small, uncoordinated groups. Israeli forces, already dug in on the West Bank, repel each attack, destroying dozens of tanks. The Egyptians throw every available reserve into the battle, but they are fragmented and confused. Some don't even know where the new Israeli bridgehead is located. The momentum shifts dramatically. What began as a desperate attempt to survive the first days of war has now turned into a deep Israeli penetration on the Egyptian side of the canal. With each destroyed SAM site, the Israeli Air Force grows stronger. With each Egyptian counterattack stopped, Israeli control of the West Bank solidifies. By the end of the day, Israel is no longer on the defensive in the Sinai. Sharon's forces now sit in a position to cut off the entire Egyptian Third Army, the army that had been Israel's biggest threat just days earlier. Shift back north, where the war enters another dangerous phase. After stabilizing the Golan Heights and pushing Syrian forces back across the lines, Israeli units begin a bold counteroffensive straight toward Damascus. Tank brigades advance through the broken Syrian positions, passing burned-out vehicles and abandoned supply trucks. Israeli artillery pounds the main highway leading to the capital. For the first time, the Syrian government begins to fear the collapse of its own defenses. Panic ripples through Syrian leadership as Israeli shells land close enough to shake the outskirts of Damascus itself. Syrian commanders report catastrophic tank losses, entire brigades reduced to a handful of vehicles. Some defensive positions dissolve completely. It looks as if Syria might fall the same way the Golan nearly fell days earlier. But then, the situation changes overnight. Iraq sends major reinforcements, not a token force, but full armored divisions. Dozens of Iraqi T-55s roar across the border, rushing straight into the fight. Jordan joins with its own armored brigade, holding defensive lines and reinforcing critical junctions. Suddenly, Israel is no longer facing a shattered Syrian army. It is facing fresh, fully equipped armored divisions with hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of troops. The Israeli advance slows instantly. Every kilometer becomes a battle. Iraqi tanks smash into Israeli spearheads, forcing Israeli brigades to halt and reposition. Syrian artillery, reinforced and rearmed, pounds Israeli columns on the move. The Syrian Air Force launches major airstrikes, sometimes dozens of jets at once, aiming to break Israeli momentum. The Israeli Air Force responds with precise counterattacks, shooting down Syrian aircraft but taking losses from anti-air defenses on the ground. The northern front becomes a brutal stalemate, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. The ground is littered with burned-out tanks from all three nations. Israeli units push forward in some areas only to be forced back hours later. Iraqi reinforcements keep arriving, complicating Israeli plans. Every day of fighting drains both sides further. Israel cannot advance any deeper without risking encirclement, and Syria cannot regain ground as fast as it loses it. The front stabilizes in a line of scorched fields, wrecked armor, and exhausted soldiers. Both sides take enormous losses. Neither side can finish the fight. The war is entering its most dangerous phase. Both fronts active, both fronts deadly, both fronts still undecided. The war enters its most dangerous stage when the superpowers step in. As Israeli units push deeper into the west bank of the Suez Canal and complete the encirclement of Egypt's Third Army, Washington realizes Israel is running out of ammunition, spare parts, and armored vehicles. The U.S. activates Operation Nickel Grass, a massive around-the-clock airlift. Giant American C-5 Galaxies and C-141 Starlifters begin landing in Israel loaded with tanks, artillery shells, aircraft parts, and guided missiles. These planes fly non-stop across the Atlantic, ignoring European governments that refuse landing rights. Every few hours, another aircraft touches down, and Israeli soldiers unload equipment straight onto trucks heading for the front. At the same time, the Soviet Union activates its own emergency effort, sending Antonov transports loaded with T-55 tanks, SAM batteries, radar systems, and ammunition to Egypt and Syria. Soviet advisors arrive on the ground to help reorganize shattered units. Suddenly, the Yom Kippur War becomes a global confrontation. While Israeli forces continue to tighten the noose around Egypt's Third Army, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat sends frantic messages to Moscow begging for direct Soviet intervention. The Soviet leadership responds with threats, warning that if the U.S. does not force Israel to stop, the USSR may take unilateral actions, which could mean sending Soviet airborne divisions or even deploying Soviet naval forces in the Mediterranean. Washington reacts instantly. The U.S. military raises its global alert level to Defense Condition 3, the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. American aircraft carriers move closer to the Middle East. Nuclear-armed bombers go on standby. For several hours, the world sits on the edge of a U.S.-Soviet showdown. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Israeli forces are still fighting. The encircled Egyptian Third Army is running out of water and ammunition. Israel refuses to loosen the ring without political concessions. The United Nations, pushed heavily by both superpowers, issues emergency ceasefire orders. Israel, Egypt, and Syria all agree, but the guns do not fall silent immediately. On October 23, and again on October 24, Both sides violate the ceasefire. Israeli units continue advancing toward Suez city. Egyptian artillery fires at Israeli positions to try to break the encirclement. For hours, the war threatens to restart at full intensity. Only after repeated pressure from Washington and Moscow do commanders finally freeze their lines. Exhausted soldiers collapse where they stand. After almost 3 straight weeks of fighting, the Middle East is silent for the first time since Yom Kippur afternoon. The Yom Kippur War reshapes the Middle East in ways that are still felt today. Militarily, Israel ends the war with its army inside Egypt and only a few dozen kilometers from Damascus, which means Israel can claim a battlefield victory. But the psychological landscape is completely different. Before 1973, Israel carried an aura of absolute military dominance after its lightning victory in 1967. The Yom Kippur War destroys that myth. Egypt and Syria prove that Israeli intelligence can be fooled, that Israeli armor can be stopped, and that Israeli air power can be blocked by a modern network of SAMs and guided anti-tank missiles. For Israel, the cost is severe. Thousands killed, hundreds of tanks destroyed, and the country shaken by the shock of nearly losing everything in the first few days. Israel survives, but the war forces deep political and military reforms that reshape the nation for decades. Egypt, on the other hand, loses territory on the battlefield, but wins politically. Crossing the Suez Canal and smashing the Bar-Lev Line restores Arab pride after 6 years of humiliation. For the first time since 1967, the Arab world sees that Israel can be hurt, can be surprised, and is not untouchable. This new confidence gives Egyptian President Anwar Sadat the political capital he needs to later pursue peace with Israel, leading eventually to the Camp David Accords. That peace never would have been possible without the symbolic victory Egypt achieved in the early days of the war. Syria suffers massive tank and aircraft losses, and its offensive ultimately fails, but the battle earns it deeper Soviet commitment. Moscow increases military aid, signs new agreements, and reinforces Syria for decades to come. In many ways, the Yom Kippur War locks Syria even tighter into the Soviet orbit. The United States becomes Israel's main strategic partner because of the airlift. Operation Nickel Grass proves that U.S. support can shift the balance of an entire war, and from 1973 onward, the U.S. Israel alliance becomes central to Middle Eastern politics. At the same time, the Soviet Union expands its influence, pouring even more equipment into Egypt and Syria, though it ultimately cannot control how the war ends. Globally, the war triggers the oil crisis of 1973. OPEC nations launch an oil embargo in response to U.S. support for Israel. Gas prices skyrocket worldwide. Lines form at gas stations across the U.S. and Europe. The shock reshapes global economics, energy policy, and Western, Arab relations for the next 50 years. Militarily, the Yom Kippur War changes everything modern armies believe. Anti-tank missiles prove that infantry can destroy armored columns at long range. Surface-to-air missile networks show that air superiority is not guaranteed, even for advanced air forces. Intelligence failures, ignoring warnings, dismissing enemy preparations, assuming superiority, become case studies for every military academy in the world. Mobilization doctrines change as well. 1973 shows that a nation can be caught off guard and still survive, but only if it can mobilize enormous reserves within hours. These lessons influence not just Israel but NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and militaries across Asia and the Middle East. The war also reshapes diplomacy. The United States becomes the key mediator in future peace negotiations. The Soviet Union gains influence but loses its chance to dictate the outcome of the war. Egypt ultimately shifts away from the Soviet camp and toward the U.S., leading to the first Arab-Israeli peace treaty in history. Syria remains hostile but recognizes that Israel cannot be destroyed in a single blow. For the Arab world, the war restores dignity after the crushing defeat of 1967. For Israel, it creates humility. and a lasting commitment to intelligence, readiness, and technological superiority.